Okay friends, one of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of your vehicle so the suspension's hanging and the wheel's off the ground. After that, if you have a hubcap, go ahead and remove that now. Once you have the hubcap out of the way, continue on to your 4 21mm lug nuts and then remove your wheel. Now that we have the wheel off of there, let's move along to removing our front strut. To do that, you're going to want to come along the back side, follow your flex hose and your ABS wire, and you're going to find one 14mm mounting bolt. Remove that bolt. Inspect your hardware as you remove it. Now we're going to reach along the back here and we're going to start separating the flex hose and the ABS wire from the backside of the strut. Make sure you've got plenty of slack from both of these. It's extremely important. Now let's move along the backside of the strut. Along the backside here, we're looking for this plastic clip that holds the ABS wire to the strut. Carefully get underneath this area using a small screwdriver or a pick and separate it. Once you have it separated, grab that ABS wire and remove it from the area. Once again, we're trying to make sure we have plenty of slack from the ABS wire and the flex hose. The next thing we're going to do is move down to the axle nut here. Looking at it, you can tell that it's a 12 point, and you want to make sure you use a 12-point 30mm socket. Now let's use a hammer and punch, give this a loving bonk to break it free. Now let's make our way over to the tie rod end. Typically, you're going to find that you have some sort of locking cotter pin. Remove that, and then remove your mounting nut. We'll use an 18mm to remove our nut. Give it a quick inspection. Now I'm going to take that mounting nut and start it on a few threads. The next thing we need to do is break our tie rod end free from the knuckle. When you do this, be extremely careful not to damage the stud of the tie rod or the protective boot on the other end of the tie rod. I'll continue by using a hammer and hit directly up against the knuckle, essentially causing some vibration, trying to get this to break free. Remove your tie rod. Now you can spin this as needed. Now we can continue on by removing the caliper from the area. You don't need to touch the caliper slider bolts, but if you move a little bit further inboard, you're going to find that you have two 17mm bolts that hold the entire caliper bracket to the knuckle itself. Remove the pair. Now let's carefully grab that caliper. We're going to give it a little wiggle and try to slide it away from the rotor. While you have it apart, take a quick look at your brake pads. If it looks like they need to be replaced, it's a good time to do it. Otherwise, go ahead and take that caliper and be very careful with your flex hose. Let's bring it up and secure it to the strut. Now let's pay attention to the two mounting bolts that hold the strut to the knuckle. You're going to find that you're going to need to use a 19mm on both sides. We'll hold one side with a wrench and use a 19mm to remove the other side. Typically, I like to remove the nut, but I'll leave the bolt in there until I fully remove the other one. Now the next thing we're going to do is start removing the pair of these. As we do, this is going to want to start pulling forward towards us. Be extremely careful for your flex hose and also extremely careful for your axle CV boot. While we're sliding this towards us, pay attention to the axle. You want to make sure that you're pressing this through the wheel bearing so you do not put a tug on the axle. I'm going to press on that axle while I pull this down towards me. Now we'll carefully slide the axle out of the area. Now that we have that separated, we have a clear view of our lower ball joint mounting nut. Commonly, for these nuts, they should have some sort of locking cotter pin. Ours is missing. Yours should have it. Remove it. After that, continue on with a 19mm socket. Carefully remove this nut. Once you have it off of there, continue on by starting it on a few threads. Now let's spray this area with some penetrant. Now at this point, you'd want to continue on by breaking this free. But before we do, I want you to pay attention to your ABS wire. You don't necessarily need to disconnect the ABS wire, assuming you have something that you can wrap around the strut up high, so that way there, when we do remove the knuckle from the area, you can safely hang it and put no pressure on your ABS wire. Now to separate this, there's several ways you can do it. For me, I'm going to use a hammer and a pickle fork. We'll carefully slide this in between the lower control arm and the knuckle. While we're doing it, be extremely careful not to damage your brake rotor. Now that it's broken free, I'll continue on by removing my ball joint nut. The next thing we'll do is carefully lift up on our knuckle. You want to be extremely careful, once again, for your ABS wire. Now let's carefully hang this so we're putting no pressure on that ABS wire. Let's make our way to the sway bar link. Now that I have this sprayed down, I'm going to continue on using two 14mm. I'll use one along the top and one down along the bottom. We'll completely get this sway bar link out of the way so we can continue on removing the lower control arm. We'll remove our washer and our rubber bushing. Now we're going to carefully start driving this down and out. As we do, we'll continue removing each piece along the way. To get the rest of this out of here, I'll carefully use a pry bar. I'm going to come inside the slot of the control arm and gently pry this down. Once you have all the parts for your sway bar link removed, continue on by inspecting it. The main part that you want to inspect is the rubber bushings of the sway bar link. Those are typically the areas that go bad. Assuming those look good, continue on by inspecting the main bolt for it. If it looks like it's rotted or weak or damaged, you're going to want to go ahead and replace it. We'll set this aside. We can continue on by removing the rest of our mounting bolts. You'll find that the forward mounting bolt, if it was to try to slide out of here, is going to hit up against your transmission pan. That's no good. With that said, move towards the center. In between your engine and transmission, you have an area that you can carefully jack. Generally, it's a good idea to use a piece of wood so you don't damage the metal. Now, as I start jacking this up, you want to pay attention to the forward bolt. We're trying to just jack this up far enough that we'll be able to gain access and remove that bolt. That should be good. Now let's use a 19mm socket to remove this. Now we can start removing our rearward bolt. you're going to find that you have an area for a 17mm down here, and the bolt goes all the way up through the subframe, control arm, through the subframe on the other side, and then there's a 17mm nut. Hold that nut, remove the bolt. Good. We'll give those an inspection and set those aside. Now at this point, there's nothing holding this control arm in here. You want to be extremely careful, but what we're going to do is use a pry bar, come in between the subframe and the control arm. We'll gently start pulling the control arm away from the subframe along the front. Now that I have the front separated, we're going to pay attention to the back. We need to take this and carefully pull it out diagonally away from the vehicle. Sometimes you can pry it, other times you can just give it a little tug. There it is, friends. Now with the control arm out of there, it's important to make sure you clean and inspect your mounting areas. We have this area of the subframe and this area of the subframe. Use a wire brush, clean it up, make sure it's not rotted. Now typically what I like to do is use a little bit of grease along this area here. We want to make sure the bushing can slide in with as little resistance as possible. Now that we finished that, continue on by cleaning the threads on both of your mounting bolts. Once you have the bolts cleaned and thread locked, we're going to continue on to installing the lower control arm. What you'll find during the installation is that your sway bar hangs a little low. Now to easily jack this up and still have space to put the control arm in, we'll go over to the other side of the vehicle and gently start jacking up underneath the control arm. We'll notice that this side of the sway bar goes up as well. Now we can continue on by putting in our lower control arm. While putting in the lower control arm, we're going to start with the rearward bushing. Go ahead and put it into the proper position. As I start sliding this in here, you'll notice it's at an angle. We need to make sure it's straight as possible. To straighten it out, generally you can use a long screwdriver. We'll put it up and through that bushing hole. Now as I start sliding it in, I'm also going to continue on by sliding the forward end into position as well. Sometimes you need to give it a loving bonk with a rubber mallet. Continue by raising or lowering your engine as needed to put in your mounting bolt. We'll start that in with a ratcheting wrench. We'll leave this bolt nice and loose, and now we can continue on to the rearward bushing. Now to maneuver this around, typically as long as the control arm bushing semi-lined up with the subframe, you can use a screwdriver. We'll come right up through the center. And now essentially all I want to do is try going up as far as I can and get this straightened out so I'll be able to put in my mounting bolt through from the bottom up to the top, and then I'll start on my mounting nut. Mounting nut up along the top. Now let's make our way over to the passenger side control arm and remove our jack. Jack over to the driver's side. we're going to continue by raising the lower control arm so it's in approximately its original ride height position. Once you have it so it's essentially parallel to the ground, continue on tightening up your mounting bolts. Let's move to the rearward bushing, put our wrench on top, and tighten the lower aspect of the bolt. Once they're both bottomed out, we're going to torque each of these. Starting with the front bolt, torque this one to 65 foot-pounds. Now we'll move to the rear and torque that one to 97 foot-pounds. Now we can remove both of our supports. Now it's going to be time to put in the sway bar link. Carefully use your pry bar. Come in the slot in the lower control arm. Gently pry it down as needed. Now we can start putting together our sway bar link. You want to make sure you have the entire bolt area, you have one washer, and you have one of your bushings. Now real quick, looking at the bushing, up along where my index finger is, you can tell that there's a ridge along the center. Along the bottom, there is not. You want to make sure you put the bushing with the ridge facing towards the control arm. Now let's go ahead and slide this up and through from the bottom of the control arm. We'll take one more of our rubber bushings and we'll slide it on there with the ridge, once again, facing towards the control arm. Once you have that on there, continue on to another one of your washers. We want to make sure we have it beveled towards the bushing. Continue on with your spacer. Go ahead and slide that up. We're going to put another washer on there, and above that washer, we're going to put a bushing. So you know the way you have to put the washer. For the bushing, we have the ridge facing towards the sway bar this time. It's going to go right up and through there. At this point, you can release the tension on your control arm. Now let's continue with another rubber bushing, another washer, and our mounting nut. Now at this point, we're going to continue tightening this. When you tighten it, you don't want to continue tightening until it's completely bottomed out. The only thing you want to do is pay attention to each of the bushings. We want to make sure that the bushings are touching up against either the sway bar itself or against the control arm. Once they touch, you're pretty much good to go. You don't need to continue going until the bushings are completely flattened out. That'll damage the bushings and make them go bad faster. Inspect all of the bushings. Make sure they're touching as required. Now we can take that knuckle and we'll slide it right over the ball joint stud. Once you have it slid down on there, go ahead and pull it aside. We'll continue on by starting on our ball joint nut, bottom it out, and then torque it to 72 foot-pounds. Now we can bottom out this nut and then we'll torque it to 72 foot-pounds. Now as we go to torque this, you're going to find that the knuckle is going to want to spin on you. We'll continue on by using a screwdriver through one of these holes. Now we can torque this to 72 foot-pounds. There we go. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the stud of the ball joint. Looking at it, you're going to find that it has a hole, making its way all the way through the center. Looking at the ball joint nut, you can tell it's a slotted nut. What we need to do is line up the slot with the corresponding hole in the stud. If for some reason it is not lined up, continue tightening until the very next slot does. Now we can install our locking cotter pin. Next, let's apply some copper never sees on the back side of the bearing, where the axle needs to go. Let's take that axle and carefully slide it through the backside of the knuckle directly into that bearing. Now we'll continue by sliding this up, lining the knuckle up with our front strut. Once you get that together, the next thing you want to do is line up your mounting bolt holes. Sometimes you need to adjust the suspension by either raising or lowering the control arm as needed. Start on both of your mounting nuts. Once you have them both started, bottom them out and then torque each of these to 97 foot-pounds. Now it's going to be time to put the caliper back on. Before you do, make sure you clean the threads on the mounting bolts and apply some red thread locker. We'll start in each of our mounting bolts and bottom them out. Now that we have both of them bottomed out, continue torquing each of them to 65 foot-pounds. Now we're going to move along to this area along the back of the strut. Take the flex hose and pull it up towards the strut. Next, we're going to grab onto the ABS wire. Looking at the bracket, along the top you have a hook, and along the bottom you have a lower little piton. That lines up with this slot right here, and then you just roll it into the proper position. As you can tell, the bolt hole lines up perfectly. Now you can take your flex hose, slide it down into the upper slot, and line up that bolt hole as well. Once all three bolt holes are lined up, continue on with your mounting bolt. For this, you never want to use thread locker, but you can use a little bit of copper never seize. Snug it up. Give it a wiggle to make sure it's completely secure. Go ahead and reattach your ABS wire. Squeeze that in, listen for a click, make sure it's secure. Now it's time to reattach our outer tie rod to the steering knuckle. Go ahead and carefully slide it into the proper position. Start your mounting nut on there, bottom it out, and then we're going to torque this to 36 foot-pounds. Now the next thing you want to do is pay attention to the hole that's through the center of the tie rod stud. You want to make sure it lines up with one of the slots on your mounting nut. If for some reason it is not, continue tightening the nut until the very next slot does. Let's take that locking cotter pin, slide it right on through the tie rod end. Peen it over so there's no way this can loosen up on its own. The next thing we're going to do is continue on by putting on our axle nut. As we put it on, you want to make sure you turn it on by hand as far as you can, bottom it out, and then we're going to torque it to manufacturer's specification. Now the next thing you want to do is carefully get the wheel closer to the ground. You'll notice I put a pry bar going across my lug studs diagonally all the way to the ground. The reason for that is because I need to prevent this whole thing from spinning while I torque my axle nut. With that said, we're going to torque the axle nut to 159 foot-pounds. Now that we have the axle nut torqued, the next thing you want to do is pay attention to the slot on the axle itself. The reason that the axle has a slot is so you can take a hammer and punch and drive the nut down into that slot. That's going to hold it in the fully locked position. so it does not loosen while you're driving down the road. Go ahead and remove that safety lug nut. Now we can reinstall the wheel. Once it's up on there, start on all 4 of your lug nuts. Bottom them out. Get the wheel back on the ground. Once you have it down there, we'll torque each of these lug nuts to 76 foot-pounds. Now with the wheel safely back down on the ground, we can continue torquing each of these lug nuts to 76 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. If you have a hubcap, put that on now. The area that you want to pay attention to is the slot that's for the valve stem. That's what your valve stem looks like. Go ahead and line it up, knock it into position. Make sure it's completely secured so it does not fall off while you're driving down the road.